começam 30 minutos atrasados. So we are very happy to have Steve Levitsky here with us today. Steve has a PhD from Berkeley in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. 2000, he was already a professor at Harvard, where he is up to now. But if you look at his CV, he has been going up in the steps. Every time he gets, every 5 years or so, a new title, a new professorship. Now he is the Rockefeller. What is your?
Rockefeller, Professor of Latin American Studies.
Rockefeller Professor of Latin America. His first book, I think, is the product of his PhD dissertation, is on the transformation of the Peronism in Argentina. Is today a classic on this transformation from a union party to a clientelist party. And after that, he published more than 14 books or more, even more.
A little exaggerated.
No, I counted. There are lots of cooperations, but he recently published a book that is translated into more than 20 languages. That is How Democracies Die. And that put him in another level, so to speak. He's not a Latin Americanist anymore. He's a comparativist. And his more recent book with Ziblatt is The Tyranny of Minorities. That is about the American politics. And this is what is interesting, is that comparativists and Latin Americanists now have a knowledge or some know-how to deal with the United States. So the United States finally arrived at its destination, right? It's part of Latin America right now. So he will present for us today. We are very pleased to have him here presenting his recent book that will be translated in 20 languages in 2 or 3 years, right? So thank you, Steve. We are very glad to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I'm so sorry to have to speak in English, but my Portuguese is a tragic embarrassment. And thank you, Fernando. I am really, really honored to be here. I've wanted to come for a long time, and I'm a big, big admirer of the work of Fernando and many, many other scholars here at USP. So it's really great to be here. As Fernando said, I'm going to talk about our latest book, which in English is called Tyranny of the Minority. Our Brazilian publishers were the only publishers who insisted on changing the title. And they used a title that my agent wanted us to call it in English. They wanted to call, the agent thought it would sell better if we called it Saving Democracy. And so, but you guys are the only ones who actually, Brazilians are the only ones who actually called it that. We'll see. Wow, that's a lot of order. Thank you. As Fernando said, I'm not I hope I don't bore you with too much discussion of the United States, but hopefully it's a useful set of lessons. But this is going to be a talk mostly about the U.S. I'm not an expert on the United States, but the problem we have in the United States is, as Fernando said, we never really treated the United States as a case in comparative politics. And because American scholars, rightly or wrongly, took the regime, the political regime, for granted, nobody studies democratic stability or regime stability in the United States. So when the crisis hit us beginning in 2016, it was only scholars of comparative politics who had anything to say about the situation in the United States. Americanists were like, well, I study legislative committees in the United States, and this doesn't really fit my paradigm. So comparative politics has a lot to say, not always correct, but has had a lot to say about recent developments in U.S. politics. So let me start. That requires my glasses. The United States, as all of you know, I think, is experiencing real democratic backsliding. All of the leading global democracy indices in the world register a decline, a significant decline for the United States since 2016. Just to do one example, Freedom House has a global freedom index that scores all countries from a low of 0 to a high of 100 every year. A decade ago, during the Obama administration, the United States received a score of 92 out of 100, which is not the top. It's not as high as Scandinavia, but it put the United States broadly in the same level as Canada and Italy and Japan and the UK. Today, the U.S. score is 83, which is tied with Panama and below Argentina, which the Argentines love to hear. The Argentines aren't shocked by that. Americans are shocked to hear that that U.S. democracy is ranked below Argentina. But when you have widespread efforts to restrict access to the ballot, when you have violent threats, widespread violent threats against election workers and election officials and elected officials, when you have an attempt by the sitting president to overturn an election and block a peaceful transfer of power, you fall to a point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because that doesn't happen in Argentina. Now, this wasn't supposed to happen in the United States. Political scientists don't know much, but we have discovered two seemingly rock-solid facts about democracies. Fernando will be familiar with these. One is that rich democracies do not die. The wealthiest democracies ever to break down, Argentina and arguably Hungary, had per capita GDP of somewhere around $18,000 in today's dollars when they broke down. The United States is 4 times wealthier than that. The second seemingly rock-solid fact about democracies is that old democracies never die. Democracies are not like human beings. They get more robust with time. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever collapsed. In fact, I think over 43 has never collapsed. So even if we date the birth of United States democracy at 1965, which is when we achieved full suffrage, even then, U.S. democracy was above 50 years old when Donald Trump was elected. So statistically speaking, U.S. democracy ought to be safe. But it's not. At least we don't think it is. And our book tries to explain why U.S. democracy isn't entirely safe. And we argue most centrally that the United States is undergoing a really unprecedented transition among democracies, a transition in which a long dominant ethnic majority loses its dominant status. That transition to a truly multiracial democracy has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. But that, we argue, is only part of the story. Our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. I will take each of these parts of the book, or parts of the argument, in turn. The principal, or at least the most immediate problem facing U.S. democracy is that one of our 2 major political parties has abandoned its commitment to democracy. It's hard to sustain a stable, or what we used to call a consolidated democracy, when one of 2 major parties is not committed to democratic rules of the game. Parties that are committed to democracy are what the great Spanish political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats. Politicians or parties that are committed to democracy arguably must do a minimum of 3 things. They must do 3 things. First of all, they must always accept the results of elections, win or lose. That's sort of the cardinal rule of democracy. Second one that Linz always made a big deal of is they must unambiguously, under all circumstances, reject political violence. Democratic parties and politicians must reject violence. And third, they must break completely with violent or anti-democratic forces. The first 2 principles, accepting election results and avoiding or eschewing violence, are pretty straightforward. I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this third principle, breaking with anti-democratic forces. Individual leaders, even really authoritarian ones, can rarely kill a democracy on their own. They need the cooperation. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. And these are what Linz called semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats are regular mainstream politicians. They look, they dress, they usually talk like ordinary politicians. But they differ in one important respect. They differ in how they respond to authoritarian threats. When loyal Democrats, when parties and politicians who are committed to democracy encounter anti-democratic extremists, particularly in their own camp, on their own side, in their own party, they do three things. This is taken from Juan Linz. First of all, they publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior, even if it's among their allies. Secondly, they expel anti-democratic forces from their ranks. They refuse to nominate them. They refuse to appoint them to positions of public office. They refuse to support their candidacies. And third, they are willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals, parties from the other side of the political spectrum, in order to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremists. So those are basic rules of loyal democratic behavior in the face of an authoritarian threat. Semi-loyal politicians do none of these things. So rather than publicly repudiate violent or anti-democratic behavior, they will downplay it, they will justify it, or in many cases they'll just sort of maintain a cowardly silence. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists from their ranks, semi-loyalists tolerate them, accommodate them. They might even nominate them for higher office. And crucially, semi-loyalists refuse to work with partisan or ideological rivals to defeat anti-democratic extremists, even when democracy is threatened. History shows us that semi-loyal behavior on the part of mainstream politicians strengthens anti-democratic forces. When mainstream politicians tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremists, it normalizes them. The media start to treat them like ordinary politicians. Leading pollsters or consultants start to return their phone calls. Donors decide that it's okay to give money to their campaigns. A clear lesson from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1930s, South America in the 1960s and 70s, is that when mainstream political parties of the center-left, the center-right, when they tolerate, when they flirt with violent extremists, democracies get into trouble. Since 2020, since after we wrote How Democracies Die, the Republican Party has violated all three of these basic rules of loyal democratic behavior. Not only was Trump the first president in the history of the United States to refuse to accept defeat and to try to overturn an election, but the bulk of the Republican Party leadership went along with him. A group of journalists evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress, the House and the Senate, in the aftermath of the 2020 election. They evaluated all of their public statements to see whether they cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election. 86% of them made statements that cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Almost the entire party. Republican politicians have also begun to flirt with political violence. During the 2022 legislative election campaign, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican ads, campaign ads on TV, in which candidates fired weapons of war, fired automatic weapons. I can think of no other major party in any established democracy in which candidates so openly embrace violence. But perhaps the most dangerous feature, if not so obvious, the most dangerous feature of the contemporary Republican Party is its refusal to break with anti-democratic extremists. Semi-loyalty, what Linz described as semi-loyalty, is now pervasive within the Republican Party. Republican politicians knew that Trump lost the 2020 election. They were well aware of that. Many of them were privately very troubled by Trump's undemocratic behavior in the aftermath of the 2020 election. But they enabled that behavior anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th uprising. And crucially, of course, they all backed his candidacy for president in 2024, despite the fact that he was indicted for trying to overturn an election. So why the hell is this happening? What would drive a mainstream center-right party that's been competing peacefully in elections for a century and a half? What would drive such a party to suddenly turn away from democracy? We argue that it's a fear of losing. For democracy to work, parties have to be able to lose. Pretty basic. Nobody likes losing, but you've got to be able to suck it up, go home, get drunk, get up the next day, and life goes on. So parties have to be able to tolerate losing. When parties, or importantly, their supporters, perceive losing to be more than just an unhappy day, but to pose an existential threat, when losing is perceived to pose an existential threat, parties tend to radicalize, and they sometimes turn against democracy. We've seen this before in the United States. It's not the first time. Think about, or let me tell you about, Southern Democrats, the Democratic Party in the U.S. South, in the post-Civil War reconstructions, the 1860s and 1870s. Reconstruction, the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, was the United States' first experiment with multiracial democracy. It brought widespread black enfranchisement across the U.S. South in the late 1860s and early 1870s. African Americans were an outright majority or a near majority in every state in the U.S. South. So the immediate total enfranchisement of African Americans terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did black suffrage threaten the Southern Democratic Party's electoral dominance, which was bad enough, it threatened the entire racial order in the U.S. South. So the Democrats, the party of the overwhelming representative whites in the U.S. South, abandoned any pretense of democracy. As one North Carolina congressman, a Democrat, said at the time, in late 1860s, we cannot outnumber the Negroes, and so we must either out-cheat, out-count, or out-shoot them. And that is exactly what the Democrats did. They used a combination of violent terror and election fraud to seize power across the U.S. South. And then they entrenched themselves in power by using poll taxes, literacy tests, and a set of other regulations to effectively wipe out African American voting rights for a century. So this was a party that, unwilling to lose, stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in almost a century of authoritarian rule in the U.S. South that lasted into the early 1970s. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. And the roots of this phenomenon today lie in the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, America's second experiment with multiracial democracy. The civil rights revolution of the 1950s, 60s, 70s generated a fair amount of resentment among white voters, especially in the U.S. South. And whites in the U.S. South were overwhelmingly members of the Democratic Party. The Republicans were the minority party in the 1960s. Since Roosevelt, the Democrats have been the dominant party. Republicans are the minority party. But white resentment in the South over civil rights created an opportunity for the Republican Party to go and expand its base, to win over white voters in the South. So beginning with Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, continuing with Richard Nixon, continuing with Ronald Reagan, the Republicans spent about 20 years explicitly targeting racially conservative white, eventually white Christian voters. And the strategy worked. It was incredibly successful. Southern whites flipped from being overwhelmingly Democrats in the 1960s to being overwhelmingly Republicans in the early 21st century. The Republicans effectively became the party of white Christians in the United States. They won the white vote in every presidential election of my lifetime since 1968. And because the United States electorate was still overwhelmingly white and Christian in the 1970s, 80s, even the 90s, the Republicans did in fact become the majority party. If you're the party of white Christians and the country is 80% white Christian, you're going to do pretty well. And in fact, the Republicans won every presidential election in the United States between 1968 and 1988, with the exception of the Watergate election of 1976. That's a pretty good run. That's a lot of success. But the strategy eventually ran into trouble, because at the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976, when I was a kid, to 43% in 2016. That change, the diversification of the U.S. electorate, posed two threats to Republicans. The first was electoral. It became increasingly difficult for an overwhelmingly white Christian party to win national majorities in the United States in the 21st century, which is why the Republicans have not won the popular vote for president since 2004. How many of you were born after 2004? Anybody? You guys are old. Anyway, since you were children. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote, and he coasted to a landslide victory. 32 years later, 2012, Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote, crushed among white voters, still lost the election. When Republican leaders realized that they were winning the vote, the white vote, but losing the American vote, they started to panic. But the problem went deeper than just losing elections. For much of the Republican base, for its rank and file, for its activist base, the United States' transition to multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat. It was more than just losing elections, because white Christians are not just any group in the United States. For 2 centuries, for 200 years, they occupied the top rung of the United States' economic, political, social, cultural hierarchies, right? They were the politicians, they were the judges, they were the CEOs, they were the university presidents, they were the newspaper editors, they were the TV celebrities. All the way up until my bar mitzvah in the early 1980s. The early 1980s. Every single president, every single vice president, every single Speaker of the House, every single Senate majority leader, every single Supreme Court Chief Justice, every single governor, every single Fortune 500 CEO, every single Miss America, every one of them was white. All of that is now ending rapidly and relentlessly and right before our eyes. The number of black and Latino members of U.S. Congress has more than quadrupled since my bar mitzvah, from 28 in 1980 to 114 today. For the first time in the history of the United States, the percentage of African Americans in the U.S. Congress is equal to the percentage of African Americans in the U.S. population. African Americans are not underrepresented in the U.S. Congress. In 1965, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 out of 9 are white men. Only 6 out of 9 are white. And the change goes way beyond national politics. We see the change in the rapidly growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on television commercials, in movies, on TV shows. We see it in the mounting societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests. We see it in challenges every day in newsrooms, in classrooms, to historical narratives about our country that downplay or ignore America's racist past. We are witnessing in the United States an unprecedented assault on our country's racial hierarchies. But when your group has been at the top of those hierarchies for 250 years, challenges to those hierarchies can feel pretty threatening. Losing one's dominant social status, one's group's dominant status, can feel like a loss, and it can feel like a threat, like an existential threat. Many Trump voters feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has pushed many rank-and-file Republicans toward extremism. In a poll about 3 years ago, sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, 56% of Republican voters agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. Now, the Republicans' radicalization would pose less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities actually govern. Trumpism, Donald Trump and his movement, have never represented a majority of Americans. Not for a single day have they had the support of a majority of Americans. In fact, I would suggest that for the first time in the history of the United States, a majority of Americans now embrace the core principles of multiracial democracy. Most Americans, a good solid majority of Americans, supported the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. More than 60% of Americans consistently say in surveys, or agree with the statement in surveys, that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. And a recent poll last year found that more than 60% of Americans think American public schools should teach our kids about America's history of racism, even if it makes those kids uncomfortable. The United States, for the first time, has a multiracial Democratic majority. But that multiracial Democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. Now, a little comparative politics here, a little political theory maybe. Counter-majoritarian institutions are absolutely essential to modern democracy. Modern democracy requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything can or ever should be up for grabs in an election. As a former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson put it, some domains must remain beyond the reach of majorities. Some things must remain beyond the reach of majorities. Daniel and I believe, or argue in the book, that two domains in particular must remain beyond the reach of majorities. The first is civil liberties. Basic civil rights like the right to vote, free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly and association, freedom to protest, must be protected from the whims of electoral majorities. No electoral majority should be able to strip away my right to free speech, free association, right to vote. Pretty basic. Second domain that must be beyond the reach of majorities is the democratic process itself. Elected governments cannot be able to use popular or legislative majorities to entrench themselves in power. For example, passing laws that weaken the opposition or undermine fair competition. That's the sort of tyranny of the majority that we saw in Chavez's Venezuela and Orban's Hungary. So we need mechanisms. Democracies need mechanisms to protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. So civil liberties and the right to fair competition are essential minority rights. That's why we need constitutional protections for civil liberties. It's why we need an independent judiciary with at least some constitutional review power. It's why we need relatively high barriers to constitutional reform. You shouldn't be able to use a short-term majority to change the democratic rules of the game. But, and this is a big but in the United States because Americans don't go here very often, not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. Democracies, sometimes Americans need reminding, are supposed to empower majorities. So just as some domains should and must be placed beyond the reach of majorities, other domains have to remain within the reach of majorities. Two of them in particular. One is elections. Those with more votes should prevail in politics over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. There is no theory of liberal democracy that I know of that justifies any other outcome than that. The second domain that should remain always within the realm of majorities is legislation. Those who win elections should govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to permanently block legislation backed by parliamentary majorities, unless, provided the legislation doesn't violate basic rights. political institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or that prevent electoral majorities from governing are not essential to democracy. In fact, they are antithetical to democracy. The United States, as it turns out, has an unusual number of these undemocratic counter-majoritarian institutions. We've got the Electoral College, which allows losers of the popular vote to win the presidency. We have a severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to all states regardless of the number of people living in them. We have the so-called Senate filibuster, which is in effect a supermajority rule that allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority. And we have a powerful Supreme Court, not as powerful as yours perhaps, with lifetime tenure for justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations to come. I want to suggest that excessive counter-majoritarianism is killing American democracy. The concessions that were made to small states in the 1787 Constitutional Convention built a bias into our political system. It overrepresented sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College favors sparsely populated territories. The United States Senate heavily favors sparsely populated territories. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court appointees, our Supreme Court is biased towards sparsely populated territories. That rural bias is not new. It goes back to the 1780s. But in the past, it never seriously advantaged one party over the other because for the first roughly 200 years of American history, both parties had rural wings and urban wings. So it was always biased against urban areas, but it was never biased against a party before. But today, in the 21st century, U.S. parties have split for the first time along urban-rural lines, the Democrats being the party of the cities and the Republicans being the party of sparsely populated territories, small towns and rural areas. That gives the Republican Party, through no fault of its own, an advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Republicans, again, have won the popular vote for president once since 1988, and yet they have controlled the presidency for half of the 21st century. A popular majority was not enough for Joe Biden to win the presidency in 2020. He had to win by about 4 points in the popular vote to win the presidency. Had he won by 2 points like Lula did in 2022, Trump would have been re-elected president. And Kamala Harris faces a very similar situation right now. The Senate's even more skewed. In recent years, the Democrats have had to win the popular vote for the Senate by about 5 points in order to retain control of the Senate. That means even if the Democratic Party consistently wins 51, 52% of the popular vote for the Senate, the Republicans will control the Senate. Senators are elected to 6-year terms in the United States, and we have Senate elections. 1/3 of the Senate is renovated every 2 years. So it takes 6 years to fully renovate the U.S. Senate. The Democratic Party has won the popular vote in every 6-year cycle since the year 2000, and yet the Republicans have controlled the Senate for half the time. In 2016, the Democrats won the popular vote for the presidency, and they won the popular vote for the Senate, and yet the Republicans won the presidency and won control of the Senate. This is minority rule. I can think of no other term to describe it. The composition of the Supreme Court is also skewed. 3 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. If the popular vote, if majority rule, determined who won the presidency and who controlled the Senate, like in most democracies, the U.S. Supreme Court today would have a 6-3 liberal majority, not a 6-3 conservative majority. So U.S. institutions increasingly allow those who win fewer votes to govern those who win more votes. Again, that's minority rule. Now, minority rule is pretty much a uniquely U.S. phenomena at this point. In no other established democracy can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities as consistently or as consequentially as in the United States. Why is that the case? Counter-majoritarianism used to be widespread. Europe had all sorts of unbelievably undemocratic institutions in the 19th century. Monarchies with veto power, indirect elections, unelected or badly malapportioned legislative bodies. But over the course of the last roughly 120 years, the last century, other democracies, not only in Europe but in Latin America, have gradually shed their pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened its House of Lords, stripping it of veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal got rid of their undemocratic upper houses. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. Canada, Britain, France, other democracies established cloture rules that allowed simple majorities to end parliamentary debate, so no filibuster-like mechanisms. All European and Latin American democracies established either term limits or a retirement age for their Supreme Court justices, and every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies across the world, not only in Europe but also in Latin America, have become more democratic over time, eliminating 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majorities. Only the United States has retained most of its pre-democratic institutions. So today, again, the United States is the world's only presidential democracy with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world, except for Brazil. No other democracy allows a congressional minority to routinely veto regular legislation backed by a majority. And the United States is the only established democracy with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. In our book, Ziblatt and I propose a set of reforms to democratize American democracy, to help democratize U.S. democracy. And that the reforms include direct presidential elections, elimination of the Electoral College, elimination of the Senate filibuster, a more proportional Senate, and term limits for Supreme Court justices. But those are obviously long-term reforms. None of those reforms are going to pass certainly this year before the election. And right now we face a pretty imminent authoritarian threat. And my concern, and I'll finish with this, is that North Americans don't have the tools to deal with an authoritarian threat from within. Many democracies, as you know, empower state officials, judges or other state officials, to bar candidates, to ban candidates or parties that pose a threat to democracy or the rule of law. Now, that is a double-edged institution. It's a controversial institution. But it's a means of dealing with authoritarian threats from within. So Brazil's response to Bolsonaro and his attempted coup was far, far more muscular than anything we saw in the United States. Again, Bolsonaro was barred from running for public office, might end up in prison. Trump, by contrast, has been granted virtual legal immunity and is, of course, free to run again. It's a pretty stark contrast. Now, the United States does, in fact, have a constitutional mechanism to bar candidates who have engaged in insurrection. Article 3 of the 14th Amendment allows that. This was targeted for participants in the Civil War, in the Confederate Army. But the Supreme Court struck down efforts to use that mechanism against Trump. The Supreme Court also very actively undermined efforts to hold Trump legally accountable for January 6th and for the effort to overturn the 2020 election. So the state, for better or worse, the U.S. state is not going to protect us from Trump. If you don't have the state, what do you have? The next sort of obvious alternative are political parties, political elites. And a second tool to protect democracies from authoritarian threats is the formation of broad multi-party coalitions to isolate extremists. This is what the French call a cordon sanitaire. We saw this really effectively in Poland last year. We saw it a few weeks ago in France. Parties from across the political spectrum, usually left, center, center-right, joined together to ensure that extremists don't make it into power. This also has not occurred in the United States, primarily because a two-party system makes it really difficult to do. Very few anti-Trump Republicans, and there are many Republicans who really dislike Trump, very few of them have actually endorsed the Democrats. And the Democrats have shown very little interest in sharing in sort of bipartisan tickets. So there's been very little multi-party coalition building in the United States. A third tool, if you don't have the state, if you don't have parties, a third tool for defending democracy is what Daniel and I call societal mobilization, where business leaders, unions, religious authorities, other influential societal actors take a high-profile public stance against extremist forces. They very publicly draw a red line and say, can't cross this line. We saw this very effectively, actually, in Germany earlier this year after the AfD was linked to a Nazi-like mass deportation scheme. Business leaders, labor leaders, religious leaders came out very forcefully and said this is not acceptable. You can't vote for this Nazi-like party. We saw this in a very different way in Israel in response to Netanyahu's judicial reforms. Business, labor, universities, former generals, celebrities, all very publicly defending democratic institutions. We saw it to a degree, I think, here in Brazil in 2021 and 2022. There has not been much societal mobilization in the United States. After January 6th, many business leaders made a very public commitment not to give money to elected officials, to congresspeople, senators who did not accept the results of the 2020 election. That's a great thing to do. Turns out, within a few months, most business leaders had abandoned that commitment. They just quit. They started funding them again. And whereas German religious leaders very forcefully denounced the AfD for its mass deportation scheme, German bishops said good Christians cannot vote for a party that engages in mass deportation. U.S. religious leaders remain silent, despite the fact that Trump promises a similar deportation scheme. So to sum up very quickly, there are three broad ways, I think, to defend, active ways, to defend a democracy from authoritarian threats. You can empower the state to ban anti-democratic actors. This is what we saw with Bolsonaro in Brazil. You can rely on political elites to forge broad coalitions to isolate and defeat extremists. This is what we saw recently in France and in Poland. Or you can rely on influential societal actors to mobilize against authoritarians, as we've seen in different ways in Germany and Israel. My concern, and I'll say this in closing, is that Americans are pursuing none of these strategies. Instead, we have left the fate of our democracy to the electoral marketplace, a marketplace that paradoxically is distorted by counter-majoritarian institutions. It's not even a free marketplace. The United States stands half asleep at a crossroads. We will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century, or we will not be a democracy. Both of those roads lie ahead of us, and there's no turning back. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We have like a half an hour or so, a little bit more, for questions, for discussion, to take the opportunity to hear, to listen, Steve, to go over these topics. So I ask who has a question to raise his hand, come here. But I do ask you to be objective. Question. No, I blah, 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 blah. Question. I think you'll have to. Yeah, you are on TV. Não, beleza. Rapaz é dinâmico.
Hi. I was thinking about UK. in the most recent election there.
In where?
In UK. In the most recent election there, in many districts, the Worker Party has gained much more. Nationally speaking, this party gained much more seats than it won if you sum their popular vote, because I believe UK has become a multi-party system recently. There are the extremists on the far right, the Green Party, and the Liberals have grown a little. So, do you think it will have a fate like America had?
That's a great question. So Britain has a similar electoral system as the United States, a plurality electoral system, which is prone to creating manufactured majorities. They allow electoral pluralities to be translated into sometimes very large majorities, which I think is problematic. I think Daniel and I in our book advocate for a shift in the United States away from a plurality electoral system to a more proportional representation system where the percentage of the vote translates much more accurately into the percentage of legislative representation. So what Britain has is an artificial majority. The difference, to the extent that it matters, I think it matters some, between the United States and systems like Britain and Canada most of the time, is that the Labour Party won a plurality. It won the most votes. So you don't have a situation where the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, actually wins control of Parliament despite not finishing first. It's true the Labour Party didn't win more than 50% of the vote, but it did win a plurality. But it's dangerous. A plurality electoral system is dangerous. I think we see there are two great instances of this danger. One is Hungary in 2010, where a plurality electoral system allowed Fidesz to win a 2/3 majority in parliament, which allowed them to unilaterally impose a constitutional reform and began the backsliding in Hungary. And also in Venezuela in 1999, Chavistas used a plurality electoral system for election to the Constituent Assembly. And the Chavistas won 90% of the Constituent Assembly because of that electoral rule, which, again, allowed them to unilaterally rewrite the constitutional rules of the game, which is a real no-no for democracy. So I'm in favor, in general, of proportional representation over plurality for precisely that reason.
Next. Someone else?
So thank you, Professor. My question is about the last part of your presentation, in which you highlight two short-term strategies for confronting anti-democratic threats. In your book, I think you called as containment and militant democracy.
Yes, very good.
And my concern about this second strategy, militant democracy, and I think it's more controversial and may present risks of unintended consequence. So, for example, if you implement it too early, these measures might appear as political persecution against insignificant groups, potentially have the unintended effect of giving them visibility. So how do you analyze the process and context for decision-making, specifically the appropriate time for implementing these measures? The criteria, what criteria should be considered to avoid strategies backfire? Thank you.
That's a great question. So I obviously didn't have time to get into it in the lecture, but we do it a little bit in the book, maybe not enough. Militant democracy as an approach to dealing with authoritarian threats is debated, is very controversial, and is very double-edged, and it is extraordinarily prone to abuse. For a number of reasons. You mentioned that the banning of a party or a group or a candidate maybe too early on can be perceived as politicized. That's definitely true. In fact, efforts to bar Trump were perceived as politicized. I think going beyond that, they can be politicized. In many Latin American democracies and semi-democracies in the 20th century, the power to ban political parties or ban usually populist parties or parties of the left was routinely abused, and routinely it was done in ways that were not transparent, and they were often nakedly politicized. So this is a very powerful weapon in the hands of the state that is easy to abuse. So if this set of rules is going to be used, first of all, the institutions in charge of this process have to be very credible and independent, very professionalized. It's imaginable in Germany. It's harder to imagine in Peru or Argentina. They really do have to be independent institutions. And also, in my view, the bar for banning candidates has to be pretty high. And at least I'm American. I'm pretty libertarian, and so. I look at Brazil, and it seems like the power to ban candidates for corruption, for vote buying, it just seems too sweeping. They just too many candidates get banned for a democracy. Which is not to say that the ideas of militant democracy should be thrown out the window. But I agree with you. We present it to Americans as something employed by other democracies that we should contemplate. But I fully recognize it as a very, very double-edged institution.
Thank you. Edu, can you read this for me? I am without my glasses.
A question from Mariana Mazaferra. In Brazil, the army and the police played an important role in the attempt coup against democracy. What about the U.S.? Do the institutions help weaken democracy there? Thank you. And the other one would be from Fabrício Amorim. Stephen, what should be done with semi-loyal Democrats joining an authoritarian leader, rejecting the results of the electoral process? Thank you.
Okay. So in the United States, to date, we are very, very fortunate that we have no history of a politicization of the armed forces and only modest history of a politicization of the police. So thus far, the security forces up and down the ranks have not played a role in regime outcomes. This is one of the reasons why Donald Trump's autogolpe failed. I don't remember which chapter it is in the authoritarian playbook, but never ever try an autogolpe if you don't have the armed forces behind you. At least Bolsonaro knew that he needed to try to get the armed forces behind him. The worst example of trying an autogolpe without the armed forces behind you is Pedro Castillo in Peru. Somebody here should have told him. He was trying to copy Fujimori, but he got it wrong. You got to have the armed forces. So that is the professionalism of the U.S. armed forces is, in fact, so far has been a very important bastion of regime stability. It's never forever. You can never take the independence or the professionalism of the security forces for granted. I think I was somewhat surprised. Maybe I was naive, but I was somewhat surprised by the repoliticization of the Brazilian armed forces over the last decade. Obviously, a lot of progress was made in the 90s and early 2000s, but we know that can be pretty easily reversed. So there are efforts to politicize police forces. There are efforts to politicize the armed forces of the United States. It's something that we're very fortunate has not occurred, but we need to be vigilant about. What to do with semi-loyal politicians? That is a great question. Again, for political scientists, or at least we think we can identify semi-loyal politicians, but regular citizens, these guys look like regular politicians. No, and so part of what we were doing in the book is, and we wrote a couple of op-ed pieces to try to educate, if not citizens, but at least civil society and business leaders about how dangerous semi-loyal politicians can be. So they shouldn't be banned from politics. They can't be banned from politics. They shouldn't be arrested. They should be shunned. They should not be voted for by citizens, and business people should not give them money. That's how you combat semi-loyal politicians. Easier said than done.
Now, Edu, you have your question.
Two very fast questions. First one, something that you didn't mention but fits, I think, in a model is about gender, and especially the role of some kind of masculinity. And I think, and the second question, this leads me to the second question, which is the ticket itself, the democratic ticket now. How, because it seems that the Democratic Party in this sense is paying the bet by choosing a woman, black woman, Indian woman, and a man from the interior who is a nice guy, who fixes your car, who is a soccer coach and represents
American football. He doesn't know anything about soccer.
Okay, yeah. Even better.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So it's it represents a different kind of masculinity than the one that Trump and his vice represents.
Great question. So we have been criticized in both of our books, I think legitimately and correctly, for placing a lot of emphasis on race and the threat posed by the perceived threat of multiracial democracy, and paying insufficient attention to gender. I think that's correct. Gender, in addition to racial hierarchies being seriously challenged in the last 50 years, gender hierarchies have been seriously challenged in the United States and elsewhere in the last 50 years, and there's no question that is also that's contributing to the reaction. So we Daniel and I are social scientists. We try to make a parsimonious argument, but there's no question that there's a reaction against greater gender equality and equality of sexual orientation as well. There's no question that that's going on. The cleavage is not as intense. There are many more. There are more women in the Trumpist camp than there are secularists, urban voters, college-educated voters, and non-white voters. There are all those things, but women are more evenly split. But there's no question you're right about that. In terms of a non-white woman on the ticket, I mean, so Americans have still never elected a woman president. We have voted a majority for a woman president. Hillary Clinton won a majority of the votes in 2016, so we're capable of it. Look, the way I see this is, I don't know if this is quite answering your question, especially about the friendly vice presidential candidate, but in all Western democracies, the primary cleavage today really is not left-right. It is cosmopolitan versus ethno-nationalist. There is an ethno-nationalist coalition that is mostly white and religious, mostly rural, small town, pretty overwhelmingly male. And there is a cosmopolitan, this is in Britain, in Canada, the United States, Germany. It's a little different in Brazil, but I think you see this cleavage as well. And there's a cosmopolitan coalition which is urban, secular, more educated, more ethnically diverse. That cosmopolitan coalition in the rich Western democracies is a majority. It's larger. It is bigger than the ethno-nationalist coalition. The Democratic Party coalition, at least the people potentially voting for the Democratic Party, is larger than the Trumpist coalition by a lot. It's like 52% to 40%. But not only are they disadvantaged by the Electoral College, even setting aside institutions, the cosmopolitan coalition, not just in the United States but everywhere, is really fragile because it's very heterogeneous. It is ideologically heterogeneous. It is ethnically heterogeneous. It is heterogeneous in every way imaginable. So it's easy to fracture, to bleed, to demobilize parts of it who are angry. My co-author, who's much smarter than I am, immediately, soon as the terrorist attack occurred in Israel in October of last year, called me and said, this is going to be trouble for the Democratic Party. Because Muslim and Arab Americans and Jewish Americans are both of them are part of the Cosmopolitan Coalition. So it's really hard to hold together. The majority is there, but it has to be mobilized, in part because U.S. voting is voluntary. And so mobilizing it is tricky. Obama did it relatively well. Hillary Clinton couldn't do it quite as well. And it's been a struggle ever since. Obviously, Kamala Harris has done a better job of it than Biden. But it is always a struggle to mobilize the entirety of the Cosmopolitan Coalition and get them all to the polls behind a single ticket.
We have a race. No, come. No.
Sorry. Okay. I'm breaking the thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I come from the law school. I break everything. Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to ask something. Maybe it's a little bit detail that I missed in your presentation, but you said something about this in your first reply. It's concerning proportional representation and multi-party system. So, because you characterize the U.S. and the problems with electoral college, a strong Supreme Court, and a Senate that is strongly affected by malapportionment. But you don't have electoral college in Brazil, but you have a similar Senate, even stronger Supreme Court, and a House of Representatives that's even stronger affected by malapportionment. So the main difference may be actually the two-party system and multi-party system, proportional representation and plurality system. I would like to hear a little bit more about this. And when you mentioned the Senate in Germany, for instance, it is a little bit more proportional, but in Germany, the governor takes it all. So if I'm the governor of the Bavaria and I have the majority in Bavaria, all the senators from Bavaria are from my party. So it's even less proportional in some sense. The thing is that in Germany, the Senate does not participate in all lawmaking process. So it's a little. The
right.
role is not that strong. So, but I will be interested in the two-party system and multi-party system issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm not an expert in Brazil's democratic institutions, and with this guy next to me, I'm very hesitant to make any statements at all. But Brazil is also one of the world's more counter-majoritarian democracies, right? And especially in legislative malapportionment, which is terrible. So I think again, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say too much about it, but it seems that some of the things that we point to that are shortcomings of the U.S. system also do apply in different ways to Brazil. The debate about the Supreme Court. I mean, you don't have one difference is that you don't have lifetime tenure on the court, but you have a court that has become very, very interventionist in terms of making rulings in areas that, and this is obviously not an elected body, so this is a very, very counter-majoritarian process where the court is making decisions that arguably should be made by an elected legislature. So I realize that's a major point of debate and a serious and legitimate debate here in Brazil. On multi-party systems and two-party systems, there was a time not that long ago where a lot of comparativists, not just in the United States, but many comparativists, pointed to a two-party system as better for governability and sort of better for democratic stability, especially in a presidential system than a multi-party system. And Brazil was seen as a disaster for having a fragmented multi-party system. And there are ways in which, that's not completely untrue. It was never completely true. But there are some advantages to a more fragmented, fluid party system in times of polarization. And polarization doesn't take on the same sort of permanent partisan intensity here that it does in the United States. So one problem with the two-party system in the United States is that, I'm going to make a sweeping claim here that's only partially accurate, but the far right, I can't speak for Latin America, but the far right in the advanced industrialized world, it's about 30% of the electorate at max, 25, 30% of the electorate. It's nowhere near a majority. I'm not a big fan of the far right, but it's manageable. It's not a majority anywhere. The question is how that 25% or 30%, how it gets translated into political power. And in the United States is the only established democracy that I know of where that 30%, if it captures a single party in a two-party system, can actually govern alone. That 30% can govern unilaterally in the United States. In Europe, now it's possible that could happen in the UK if the Tories sort of truly become a far right party. So that it's imaginable in the UK. In continental Europe, it really is not possible. That either the far right is in opposition, or it's a coalition partner in government, like we've seen in Austria, like we've seen in occasionally in Scandinavia, like we see today in Italy. And so far, that's proven a lot less dangerous. So that's one thing about a multi-party system. The other thing is, I haven't thought this through really deeply, and so I can't articulate it very well. But Trump's control of the only political party that's a vehicle for right-wing political careers is the main reason why so many Republicans are semi-loyal. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to Americans about the difference between the Brazilian right's response to Bolsonaro and the U.S. right's response to Trump. And I exaggerate a little bit, and I probably give the Brazilian right too much credit. But there are important differences in the response. I certainly should not be arguing that the right-wing politicians in Brazil are better human beings or more democratic or anything. But the fact of the matter is, on election night in 2022, all the major right-wing politicians in Brazil accepted the results of the election, except for a few of Bolsonaro's best friends. But the ones that mattered accepted the results of the election, and the United States, they didn't. And the equivalent of Lira and Freitas, and I don't remember the name of the governor of Minas, in the United States, none of them accepted the results of the election. And so it's it would be inaccurate to call the Brazilian right fully loyal Democrats, but they behave better overall in the last 2 years, I think, than the U.S. right. I think the primary explanation for that is they're not all in a political party run unambiguously by Bolsonaro. They're able to imagine and sustain political careers with or without Bolsonaro. And so they don't depend on his electoral fate in the same way that Republican politicians depend on Trump. So it's not that, I think, and I would love to hear others if you see things differently, it's not that Brazilian politicians are necessarily more democratic, but the incentives created by a fragmented multi-party system actually worked in kind of a depolarizing way. When you have a highly polarized society, a two-party system, a rigidly two-party system, can be a disaster.
Your turn. Be fast.
Thank you. I'm Robson Carvalho, PhD candidate in political science in Brasilia University. And I'd like to know, Professor Levitsky, what is your view about the January 80, 2023? Because it's is a theme of my thesis. It's sorry.
So you should be telling me.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure for me.
Your dissertation.
Question. Okay. Very fast, Professor. Thank you.
What is my opinion about it?
Yes, your view, your opinion. Because I remember that you speak about when the event happened. When the event happened, you make an interview for some newspaper. I don't remember more.
Oh, no.
But now, what is your vision?
What did I say in the interview?
Yes, help me. I'd like to know your vision. Yes, because
No, the January 8th.
January 8, 2023. The event.
What will happen?
Yes, it's possible too.
So I may disappoint you with my answer, in part because I'm really not an expert on Brazilian politics. My first reaction was that it was a farce, that it was a very strange theatrical effort to copy what the Trumpists did in the United States. I mean, this was after the transition of power. The U.S. uprising was an active effort. It didn't succeed. It didn't come too close to succeeding, but it was an effort to block the transfer of power. The transfer of power had already happened in Brazil, so that they were not going to do that. Now, only later did I and many of us learn many of the details of just how far Bolsonaro went in plotting to overturn the election. So it was the larger process ultimately was probably even more serious in Brazil than it was in the United States. But the actual takeover of the three buildings seemed like a farce. I was, and again, I may be exaggerating the difference here, and I may be giving Brazilian politicians too much credit, but I was pleased to see all Brazilian politicians, including the right, forcefully denounce the uprising, not make any excuses for the uprising, not downplay the uprising. I was pleased to see politicians of the right pushing for a CPI, a congressional investigation into January 8th, which did not happen on the right in the United States. And I have not followed discussions about January 8th in Brazil over the last year, so I really cannot comment. But in the United States, Trump has now openly embraced January 6th and calls the U.S. judiciary was pretty good about prosecuting those who stormed the U.S. capitals. And so there are a number of people in prison for that event, just as there are in Brazil. Trump has begun to treat those convicted insurrectionists as heroes, as patriots, as political prisoners. And so Trump and his allies have begun to embrace January 6th, which is an incredibly dangerous thing. I haven't seen that happen much, at least outside of Bolsonarismo puro in Brazil, but I could be wrong. So my naive, undereducated sense is that the Brazilian right's response to that was at least somewhat healthier than that of the United States.
No. Oh, she's... Sorry.
So, I'm a graduation student here, and last semester we saw a text with the professor Rogério Arantes that's present here. And in this moment, that text elucidated the power of politicians to change the rules of the game in Brazil by authoritarian traps, as the authoritarian infralegalism in Bolsonaro government. And I would want to know if you could say some words about the Brazilian politics, because what happened during that government was not just rejecting democracy, but establishing a unique modus operandi to implement his own agenda, even without the legal court support, but by managing dialogues in multiple social spheres that the state couldn't do much to avoid that and couldn't do and didn't us. I want to know, what could you say about that? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I cannot say very much because I'm not an expert in Brazilian politics, and sadly, I've not read the text, but I should and I will. So I can't comment on having not read the text. It's tough. Let me say a couple. This is no longer balanced. I've lost equilibrium. One major point of our book, How Democracies Die, which I think, again, I cannot speak for Brazil, but that Americans don't take seriously enough, is that there are many, many informal ways to erode and damage democratic rules and norms that go beyond sort of open attacks on democracy. And we have to be aware of those things. Just today, someone asked me, well, how much of a threat is Trump really? If the armed forces are not going to be behind him, he's not going to be able to cancel elections. So really, can he really kill democracy? Well, there are a lot of ways to, at the very least, make democracy very sick and to abuse power within the formal rules of democracy. And I don't know enough about the Bolsonaro case to know what was done there. We know a little bit about Trump. Trump was very ignorant when he came to power in 2016. He had no plan. He had no team. He had no experience. And so he was a lot less damaging than he could have been. And one of our concerns is that this time around, if he returns to the White House, he has a much, much more elaborate, much more experience with the U.S. state and a much more elaborate plan to use the institutions of the state to abuse power. The final thing I would say is that it's really important that Bolsonaro was removed from power. It is, I think one of the things that it is never, ever a good idea to elect, especially in a presidential system, a president who's not committed to democratic rules of the game. Bad idea. I came here in July 2018 to Brazil, and having had 2 years of experience in my own country, told Brazilians it was a bad idea, and you guys had to learn it on your own. It's a bad idea. There's a lot of damage you can do. That said, not entirely democratic figures are getting elected. I'm sorry, I'm deviating from your question because I really don't have a good answer to it. Not entirely democratic figures are being elected across many democracies, from the United States and Brazil to El Salvador, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, elsewhere. But there's a lot of variation in terms of how much damage they do, and there's more variation perhaps than we thought 5 years ago. And we need to understand more about the conditions under which these guys fail, because they often do fail. And in many democracies, and I think we kind of have understated this, society has the resources to fight back pretty effectively against them, which is not to say we should ever take the risk of electing them, but in whether it's the United States or Poland or Brazil, or I would say Argentina and probably Mexico, despite the election of figures who were not fully committed to democracy, the the dispersion of resources across society, particularly as a result of sheer economic development, empowers opposition forces to contest, not to prevent abuse, not to prevent manipulation of the rules, but to prevent any kind of consolidation of authoritarian power. And I think that matters a lot, because when somebody like both, whether it's Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Ecuador or Korea, I know I'm going way beyond your question, but any democracy where you elect an authoritarian, even if they begin to act against democratic institutions, as occurred in Brazil, if you can get them out of power in 4 or 5 or 6 years, less than a decade, they don't have enough time to build stable networks of corruption and patronage. They don't have enough time to consolidate control over key institutions of the state, whether it's the judiciary or the electoral authorities or the armed forces or the security apparatus. And when autocrats, elected autocrats, don't have the time to consolidate their control over the state, it leaves open spaces for oppositions to contest. It gives opposition forces a fighting chance. And that, I think, is what happened in Brazil. And I think I've gone so far away from your question that I'm going to stop.
Let me take the opportunity to emphasize her question, referring to the infra-legal means that these non-very democratic leaders have to change the rules of the game. And more specifically, in the United States, with executive orders. So Trump may make a real mess this time, right?
Yes.
Changing almost everything from environmental policy to civil liberties, like the decisions about immigrants. So I think that the means, the infra-legal means are much stronger in the United States
Oh, then here?
than any other country in the
Wow.
world because
Really?
of executive orders. Because executive orders have this status that they are legal. The Supreme Court takes it as a law, but it's an executive order. It's a decree, what we call decree. So, and he has been promising to change everything on protection of the environment and immigration through executive orders. So the thing that you said, now he knows,
Right.
it's not a surprise. It's not an unexpected win. That may make things even worse than the most pessimistic.
Right. So Trump had no, very, very quickly, Trump had no know-how of the U.S. state at all when he took office. He imagined that the United States state was like Nicaragua in the 1950s, and he thought he was Anastasio Somoza. He thought that the U.S. state that he could use all state institutions immediately for his own personal ends. And he was very surprised and very frustrated that he could not. But now he has right-wing think tanks developing not literally 900-page plans to do exactly this. So what he will have to do, which he did not, he relied on technocrats, civil servants, and traditional Republican politicians to govern. Those guys didn't want to do the crazy, corrupt, abusive things that Trump wanted to do. So he now knows, and he has a team willing to implement this, that he has to purge the state of the civil service, he has to pack it with loyalists, and then he can go ahead and do exactly what you said. Excellent point.
Oh, no.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. That's great. A few replies back. You mentioned the incentives that Brazilian politicians face to accept electoral results. But I was a bit surprised, or at least was the impression that I got, when you were describing the behavior of the loyal Democrats? Because it seems that, based on your description, they should act against their political interests in the name of defending democracy. And so I want to clarify if that's the case, that's what you expect, and if so, why would a politician do that? Because they will kill their career, right? And that's why the Republicans probably don't act like the Brazilians did. So it's just, are you, I don't know, defending some cultural explanation that they got? They learned to love democracy or something like that, or they are rational politicians that seek office and they will only respond to incentives, and it's a matter of designing the right incentives for them to defend democracy. Thank you.
Great question. It's not cultural, but it's a normative argument that I'm making, and I take it directly from Juan Lin's. Loyal democratic behavior is in certain circumstances not rational. In a healthy democracy, in a stable democracy, we expect politicians to pursue their own self-interest, to be careerists, to follow their career ambitions. That, taxi drivers in Sao Paulo don't like that. Political scientists understand it. That's the way that's how politics works. And that ultimately, is okay in a stable democracy when democracy is not threatened. The argument, which is a normative argument that we make, is that when democracy is under threat, politicians need to be willing to sacrifice. They need to be able to put their careers at risk to defend democracy. And the answer to your question of why would politicians do that, the answer is that they usually don't, because they're usually rational. They usually pursue, even when democracy is on the line, and we've seen this in the United States, even when democracy is on the line, they usually pursue their career ambitions. Who didn't? Liz Cheney, the daughter of the former vice president, a very right-wing politician, broke with Donald Trump after the 2020 election, worked with Democrats in the House committee to investigate the January 6th uprising, took a very, very strong public position in defense of democracy and the Constitution against Donald Trump, and her political career, at least for now, is over. Every Republican politician, every major Republican politician who is broken with Trump and particularly in defense of democracy has seen their career derailed, at least for now. And so it's not rational. One could make an argument that had these Republican politicians been able to act collectively, they might have achieved a different outcome. But the answer is it's not rational. 9 out of 10 politicians do the wrong thing. They behave rationally and not in defense of democracy. And yet I believe, as a political scientist, that it's in books that are written for elites to read, that it's still nevertheless important for me to make the case for the right thing to do, on the hope that once in a while a few people will do it.
So the microphone is telling us that we are about to finish, right? So we have a last question here, and then we will wrap up. And Maria Elena will be happy.
So I wanted to ask you about your last sentence that you said either the U.S. accepts a multiracial scenario or it gives a goodbye for the democracy. Are you positive about that? The U.S. will embrace this scenario or not?
I'm not positive about anything, especially at this hour on a Friday. I think it's a safe claim that we are forced with that. I'm close to positive that we're faced with that choice. I don't think there's a third way. I don't think there's going back to the politics that we had prior to the slow transition to multiracial democracy that started in 1965. I'm hopeful, and I really am somewhat hopeful that we will eventually choose the path of multiracial democracy. I can talk a little bit about why. Particularly, I think the youngest generations of Americans are much more multiracial and much more tolerant than older generations. And so I'm looking at survey data and political behavior. There's reason to think that our electorate will be much more, our young generations have a bunch of problems, but I think they're much better able to live in a multiracial democracy than their parents and their grandparents. So I am hopeful. I am not positive we'll get there. I'm quite confident that the passage to there is going to be stormy. That's what we're in the middle of now. This transition is a very rocky one because the reaction is fierce and much fiercer than most of us anticipated, and we're not done. But I'm not positive. I'm nowhere near positive. But I think there's a 60% chance that we'll get to the side of multiracial democracy as opposed to some form of minority rule.
Okay, so before we close, let me make two quick questions. So you presented us an agenda of reforms to the United States. It will not pass. All of them. No. So you have to pick one. Which one? Which reform would you bet is the one that would change things or would make us more optimistic? Second quick question. Best scenario. Trump is defeated. What will he do after he is defeated?
Oh, God. I thought the first question was hard.
What do you think is his we are going to Friday night, right? We are already in the end of the day. Friday we will start to drink. So you can go and say whatever you want. We can close down the cameras if you wish.
So our list of reforms is very what's the word? Ambitious. It's not going to happen. Most of them are very hard. They're not all constitutional reforms. Some of them can be achieved by just a project of law, particularly a whole set of reforms that would make it much easier for Americans to vote, which I'm not sure that will save our democracy, but it's inherently democratic if 75 to 80% of Americans vote in elections as opposed to 50, 55, or 60%. Those reforms, those electoral reforms can be achieved with legislative majorities. It's debatable whether term limits for the Supreme Court can be achieved without constitutional reform, but it's possible. So what I would suggest as a first reform is the easiest one, which is elimination of the Senate filibuster, which would allow for passage of other legislative reforms, not constitutional reforms, but at least voting rights reforms. There was a very, very ambitious, very positive package of electoral reforms that had a majority, that passed the House of Representatives, that had a majority in the Senate, and was blocked 3 years ago by the filibuster. And the Democrat, Daniel and I actually spoke by Zoom to the Democratic Party bancada about removing the filibuster so they could pass these reforms, and all but two of them supported it. They were 2 votes away from eliminating the filibuster. And they're ready to go. This same bill would make it much easier, automatic registration to vote, voting on a Sunday, a whole set of reforms that would make it much easier for Americans to vote, is ready to go. It's ready. If the Democrats win a majority in the legislature, which is now possible, and it's a good segue to the second question, they're ready to go, but they have to eliminate the filibuster to do it. So that would be, I'm not an institution strategist, but that would be my answer. What will Trump do? So we don't know many things. And political science, I didn't tell you guys, I've given 3 lectures today, so I'm completely forgetting like who I've talked to and what I've said, but I'm pretty sure I didn't say this to this group. I'm pretty sure that the last time, I will tell the story, the last time that I correctly made an important political prediction was in 1994. Now, I'm not going to tell the soccer story. I made an incredible soccer prediction on Roda Viva in front of all of Brazil right before the Mundial, but we won't bring that up. We won't bring that up. I was in graduate school. At the very beginning of the Plan Real, when Lula was way ahead in the polls, I predicted I was a graduate student in my Latin American politics seminar with Ruth Collier. I predicted that Cardoso would come back and win. I have not made a successful prediction about politics since Fernando Henrique Cardoso was first elected in 1994.
At least you made one right.
All right. Let me say there's one prediction I know I can be confident of, and that is that Donald Trump will not accept the results of the election if he loses. He will claim fraud. And he will probably try to mobilize people against the election. He will not have, not being the president, he won't have the power of the state like he did last time. So I think he'll be less dangerous than in 2020. But he'll try to do a lot of mischief. And he may, he's a reckless guy. He could, promote, incite violence, for sure. I don't think he can do a lot of damage. I honestly, people keep asking me, well, there's two scenarios that are dangerous. Trump wins, Trump loses. I think Trump losing is a much less dangerous scenario. And I think that that might be the end of the road for Trump if he loses, and that we'll see some kind of rethinking and renovation in the Republican Party. I don't think the Republican Party is ever going to return to the Republican Party of Reagan and Romney. It's going to be a different beast, but we'll at least see initial steps toward a post-Trump era if he loses. So he'll kick, he'll scream, he'll make mischief, he'll try to incite protest and violence, but not being in the state, I don't think there's that much damage he can do.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. It was a
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.